Fiction, right?
Yeah. Sounds scary, yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, looks like everybody's here, so let's get the roundtable discussion started.
Good.
My name is Margaret Taylor, and I think probably best just go around with introductions. Looks like there's some new faces here. I've been with MNSpec for a few years now, and I will be sort of moderating the discussion, but not dominating the conversation. Everybody's free to pitch in. That's how this works. So, we can just pass it this way.
Good. Hi, I'm Celia. I've come to this group before, but I usually go to the East Paul group, and I've been going there for over a year.
My name is Alec Hendrickson. This is my first time. I joined the club because I thought it would be helpful in writing the stuff I need to write and get me some more discipline for it.
I'm Tim Rushford. I've been in the group for several years. I also oversee the critique group that comes after this. I've been working on wrapping up my novel I've been working on for the last couple of years.
Chris Carberin, I'm from St. Cloud. I've been here about a year or two, and I am just writer.
Carol Caputo, I've been here since 2011, I just looked it up. And I write a lot of contemporary fantasy and paranormal and non-paranormal, some romantic, some not. Discipline, yes, I feel your pain. So,
my name is Stephen Anderson. This is my first time here. I just happened to be on an extra long lunch break from work today, and I saw that this group was meeting up. And I've written 2 short stories, and I have like a draft of a novel that I mostly just write for fun.
Yeah, Todd Anderson. Again, yeah, same, where I just write for fun, and I just thought it'd be kind of cool to check this meetup up. And so, yeah, that's it.
Dale Brothers. Only been around for a little bit less than a year, but I've been writing for like 10 years or something like that. And sending a lot of short stories out. Most of what I do is fantasy short fiction.
Okay, Dan Goodman. I've been coming to this since near the beginning, and I decided a while ago, a few months ago, to concentrate on writing science fiction and leave fantasy alone, and then I found myself working on a fantasy novel. Okay.
I'm Conrad Zero. I'm the one without a face on the meetup. A handful of things published, and I've been a member since 2008. I'm the assistant organizer. I'll be doing, actually, I'll be heading up the next month's topic, which is critique, using critique groups, giving critique to others, receiving critique, using it in the writing process. So check that out.
I'm Randy Howland. I've had a couple short stories published. I focus or dabble in scripts and novels right now. Mainly, my main focus is children's novels.
Kate Bidders, and I am a freelance writer. And I also released my second novel this past week, or 2 weeks ago. And my book release, I left some flyers, but it's unfortunately on the same day that the anthology is being released. Couldn't be helped. But I think mine starts an hour earlier, so if people want to come, I'll actually be there from 11 to 4, but I say noon to 4 in here, so if you want to come, that would be amazing. And that is all.
Is that the one about the reporter and the guy?
No, that one is in progress.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, this one I've been working on for 4 years. So.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a dystopian novel.
All right, well, I guess we might as well get started. Does anybody want to jump in? Have you written any sort of weird creatures in your science fiction? Yes, you get started. Characters or not characters?
My series, Natural Legends, is animal fantasy, so I suppose all of it qualifies in this field, but the book I'm working on right now, Hell's Migration, as well. Well, if you know what animal fantasy is, I want this
No,
to be.
could you define to the group what that is?
Okay.
A lot of us don't.
Okay, well, it's basically stories where you have an animal as the protagonist, and you're probably thinking, but isn't that for little kids and stuff like that? Have you ever read Watership Down, Firebringer, or The Sight? All those are animal stories, and none of those are aimed at kids. Yes, but I wanted to take what's in those and make it, and time it by 10, and create a whole series based on this, and currently I'm only working on one book called Hell's Migration, shouldn't I? But I thought later today I'd start working on the next one. Anything?
I've got a book that I wrote about an invisible flying pony saving the world from terrible monsters, and there's a series of stories that I came up with, ridiculous antagonists, giant carnivores, poisonous exploding spider leeches, alien robot, zombie dinosaurs, ghostly demonic were vampires. I couldn't throw enough adjectives.
Is this like some sort of parody or something?
It's it's a horror comedy, so it's not necessarily for kids. It's not necessarily.
Sounds like it could work for bronies.
There really is no market for this.
Sounds like it could work for bronies.
I feel like there's a market for it, like Cabin in the Woods. That's self-publishing horror satire.
Yeah, John dies at the end, kind of.
Yeah.
Right, John dies at the end. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Emily the Strange might be borderline. But anyway, I say Stephen King crossed with Calvin and Hobbes because
Can I get a clarification on, because you brought up what is animal fantasy? I believe, and I'm asking the group, that spectrum includes whether there's magic involved or not, because the premise would be just being in an animal's head or animals talking is fantasy. Is that a true consensus on that?
Well, yes.
I think so.
Would you include
There is
something
magic
like,
in.
Would you include something like Beverly Cleary in there though? With like she had like one about the dog. Okay, that was like the lady who wrote like Ramona and Beezus also wrote a book about from the dog's perspective. Would that still be animal fantasy, or is that like?
Well, the premise is even being in an animal's head, is that probably a fantasy? I'm thinking the answer is yes, but I'm throwing it out there because it seems like a good discussion topic.
Well, I would say, well, I mean, I did put magic in Natural Legends. I mean, the main antagonist of the entire book is a fallen nature spirit.
I guess that would depend on, too, is whether or not the animals are having human thoughts.
Yeah.
Because there's a mystery series called, like, Doggone It or something like that, where it's written from the dog's point of view, but the dog doesn't really have human thoughts. The writer tried to get as close as they could to, like, having the dog think the dog would think.
Call of the Wild is kind of like that.
Well, I do.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, would you consider that fantasy?
So it's not
technically animal fantasy?
Well, in Natural Legends, I tried to take what they have, what science says, how they behave, and sort of interpret that into something a human could understand. So it's a fair mix.
So maybe it would depend on your point of view. If you went third person, then maybe you could get away with it. But if it was first person, animal fantasy, by definition, it would have to be.
Well, these are not. Well, none of my
first person point of view.
Well, none of my books are first person. They're all told in third person perspective.
Right, but like Call of the Wild is, I don't know, you remember, is that third person or
That's
first
third
person?
person.
Yeah.
Third person, so again, that would be a very interesting one to, on the fringe.
And as for talking animals, well, in Natural Legends, they do technically communicate, but it's not a form of communication humans can understand. So essentially what I'm doing here is taking animal communication in the form of like just sounds and stuff like that and just sort of translating it into English so that humans can read, so we still get the dialogue. But I write down that when they say, instead of said, you often say snort or growled or something that sounds more like a sound to a human.
Yeah.
Chris, let's see. If you write let's see there, if you have a story in which intelligence rises, you could have animals intelligent enough to speak.
I saw a really interesting example of that, the Uplift books. they
Gave
made
it brain?
dolphins and chimps smarter than they really are and gave them like assistive devices so that they could speak. I don't remember if they ever got to be point of view characters.
Okay, and of course, earlier, let's see, although the animals don't speak for the most part, except for chimpanzees, there is, and from the 1950s, there is Poul Anderson's Brainwave.
What's that?
Oh, what?
What is that book?
Okay, well, essentially, the solar system has been in a portion of the galaxy where thoughts or thinking is slower, and then we move out, of it, and let's see, and there's a grade school kid invents calculus is one of the first things that happens, and then later on there are things, and there are news reports of somebody who was in America first, or isolationist becomes a one-worlder, or a one-worlder becomes an isolationist, because they are intelligent enough to see what's wrong with their old views. And for much of the book, the point of view character is someone who is of low intelligence at the beginning and of comparatively low intelligence further on. And it's worth reading, although it is somewhat old-fashioned.
It sounds like what you were talking about the assistive devices, and maybe what you're talking about could be science fiction and not necessarily fantasy.
Yeah. I think in trying to define whether something is, animal fantasy or science fiction using devices to like make animals talk or technology or whatever, this is why speculative fiction is such a handy title, because it's like
Takes it all under that umbrella.
Yeah.
I actually have a sort of a talking animal sci-fi series, but it's in comic book form called BioWar, which is it's set in a dystopian future where America now rules the whole world with right-wing values. All non-white human ethnics have been driven to extinction, so instead they use animals whom they mutate into humanoids to act as slaves, but as you can pretty much go, they're not going to take this shit. So they rebel, and they actually can speak English because of their altered vocal cords. But it's kind of like Star Wars.
So it's like the Island of Dr. Moreau on steroids almost.
But these were never humans. They originally animals, or they are descendants of animals who were mutated, because the genetics have caused new generations to be born with the mutations. If a humanoid wolf and another humanoid wolf who were originally once normal wolves mate, their offspring will probably also be a humanoid wolf.
Well, there's a difference too between, I think, animal fiction and just anthropomorphizing.
I still consider that animal fiction.
Good job.
And certainly, and what I consider a horrible example is the Garfield comic strip. And for example, there are the things like the strip in which Garfield perks up when John offers him some hot cocoa, and
or lasagna.
What?
Or lasagna.
Well, lasagna cats might eat, but cocoa, caffeine is bad for cats.
So what would you guys consider best practices?
What?
What would you consider best practices for writing about, from the point of view of a cat, for instance?
Yeah. I read a really interesting one. It was a collection of short stories about this, like, it was just like this boy who would daydream. I think it was called like Daydreamer or something. But there was a short story in there where he turned into a cat. And that was interesting just because it was, I don't know. I don't know, it depends. Best practices. Maybe some novel work, but yeah, what were you going to say?
Maybe studying the animal behavior and
Yeah.
trying to mimic that at least a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And make it really
Yeah, but
attractive to
yeah.
a large audience.
And even an extinct animal you can work well. I mean, in 1993, a paleontologist, I forget his name, he wrote a novel called Raptor Red, which was about, well, a mother ute a raptor and her baby, and I don't really know the story. That's pretty much all I know.
But is that a dinosaur? Or?
Yes, that's a dinosaur.
Okay. Okay.
To clarify, Margaret, your question a little bit, are you suggesting or wondering about whether it's the animals or the critters are the main characters or supporting characters that might actually change how people respond to that question? And when you say write about critters, best practices, is it if they're supporting characters or main characters?
I was figuring we would talk about both at this session, so
Okay.
if you guys have an idea.
Yeah, and just that might change how
different
people
for
react to that question, and if you want to have either, it's fair game for either way.
See. Well, in natural legends, every main protagonist is an animal in one way or another. And they were born as them. Some of them are male, some of them are female, some of them live for the book, others die at the end. But either way, they're all animal of different species.
I'll throw out one Kidlet example. Is the Warriors, which some people might be I'm not a big fan of it, but yeah, I think it's third person, but it's about different cat clans.
Oh, and they're just about to start developing a civilization, right?
Kind of, yeah. And they're feral, so to
good.
speak, and then it's kind of the instigation. I think they call it the protagonist is a domesticated cat that either escapes or runs away.
They call them
when it's going to get
pets.
neutered, I think, huh?
The warrior gets called house cats kitty pets.
Sure, okay, so it's a kitty pet, right, that technical term. Anyway, so that's a whole world that is quote-unquote contemporary, and they're talking and things like that. So it's probably a fantasy then, if you've read it and are more familiar with it than I am. But
that's not actually the book I was thinking of.
Oh, okay.
I think it's interesting. Redwall would be another example from Kidlet, where the different species, like some of them have traits that you would associate with the species.
Some of them are pretty British.
And yeah, all of it is very British. But like for example, the rabbits are a little more high energy than the badgers or whatever, that kind of thing. But I think almost what he did there was more of like what you would do in a typical fantasy novel by assigning like different character traits to different races, where it's more like the badgers are kind of dwarf-like, where they live in a mountain and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, it's an interesting balance, and I think it depends on not only if you're getting into something like that, like the personality of the character, whether or not the species is supposed to be analogous to some idea, like Star Trek Vulcans are logical, you could assign that to, if you're doing animal at like, I don't know, lizards or something, whatever.
You brought me to think of Animal Farm,
Oh, yeah.
which is,
Yeah.
I mean, that has the traits,
There you
their
go.
psychology and their species is kind of coming out as far as pigs being the Nazis or
Yeah.
communists or whatever. I can't remember which one they were.
And then that goes back to, if you look at even stuff like Aesop's Fables, like the fox always represents like someone who's trying to trick you into
archetypes.
doing things,
Yeah.
and mythology and all that kind of stuff. So you can take symbols from like classical literature and just apply it on the way that people would understand something, or you can create a twist on that, or like you said, look at animal behavior. So really, I think best practices with whatever fits your story.
I think best practices too depends on how intelligent you're making your animals. Like Watership Down, rabbits don't know everything that's going on. They don't quite understand their world in the way that a human would. But if you boosted their intelligence a little, like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, dolphins, super smart creature.
That's what I
and
go.
it's different how you would portray those animals. One is a little naive, when you read it, and the other is super intelligent.
No, that's kind of what's going on in natural legends as well. I mean, the characters in my books, well, they don't know everything about the humans, but all that they know is what they need to know. That's something I've always thought about, this good thing with nature, is that an animal is only as smart as it needs to be.
There was a really neat bit in Watership Down. There's this one weirdo genius rabbit, and everybody else thinks it's a little bit weird. And he figures out there's this river that they need to cross, and leaves and sticks and things float. And this rabbit figures out that if they stand on top of the sticks that float, they can get across the river. And it just blows all the other rabbits' minds, which is something that we would not think is that very interesting, but for the rabbits, it's really getting into the rabbit psychology.
Yeah.
They don't think that way. And I thought it was a really great way of getting into the rabbit's mindset.
Otter Newton is kind of a study, I think, in animal, because the main character is a human with advanced mental abilities. It's sci-fi at like a post-Holocaust.
Which story is this?
Otter Newton, or Over Newton.
Okay.
It's Isabel Carmody, the Australian author. But as Elspeth, the main character, as her mental powers grow, she kind of connects with animals and can speak to them a little bit. Then she realizes, oh, they can talk too and have intelligence. So then she starts to work with them. Well, then there's conflict because then she realizes that she has conflict with the leader of the horses and what he wants and what's best for his people. And then, as the animals keep connecting with humans, the animals get smarter. So they also, then their needs and wants expand and cause more conflict as the books go on.
What's the name of the book again, you said?
Otter Newton.
How do you spell that?
Yeah, that's what part of the question too.
Oh, very smart around here.
Aber Newton?
O-B-E-R-N-E-W-T-Y-N. So the first book.
Exactly. I mean, that opens up the conflict. Yeah, like everybody thinks this romantic notion. Well, we can talk with animals, but what about the animals we eat? Does that come up in that book at all then, or not?
I just think. I'm pretty sure she becomes a vegetarian. The main character is the main character is the most powerful, so she has kind of the closest connection, and not everybody has the same mental ability. So she's a beast speaker. Not every single person is a beast speaker.
It would be hard to use something you could converse with.
Yeah. It reminds me of an idea for a scrap story I had, which was about where after a mining incident, humanity discovers another sentient Earth race that's lived underground for a long time who are far more peaceful than humans ever imagined. They disdain violence, they're kind, they're friendly to each other, and they treat all living things with respect. There's just one small problem. They are carnivores, and there's only one species they can digest. Humans.
I can't remember the title or the author, but there was a short story where the viewpoint character is a wolf in the zoo, and then one day he wakes up and he's somehow become a human. And he has some difficulty adjusting. It has a happy ending. He reads up on how to become a werewolf, and he manages to change himself back.
That's a real pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
What?
Aware, wouldn't it?
I say it would be a aware human.
You brought up an interesting thing. We're talking about the Albert thing, where like the animals kind of got, started thinking more in a human way as they. I'm sorry, it was you. All right. But I heard an interesting, I think it was Radio Lab on NPR, where they were talking about like people who are deaf who have never. They don't live in a country that has a sign language really, and how they sometimes find each other and they like develop like a little mini language, but a lot of the time it's less sophisticated than like an ASL. And then finally, when they meet people who speak sign language, they'll like finally be able to like speak to each other, and then talking about the way they used to think before they developed language and how it was different from now how they're able to think. You know,
Yeah.
the kind of thoughts they can have are different. Or if you hear from people who are bilingual, how they say, you know, like in Chinese, I think much more mellow and much more logically, whereas when I speak English, I think a little bit more like.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay, Helen Keller wrote about that. She about the difference between the before and after she was taught deaf-blind sign language, and you might want to look up Nicaraguan sign language. Essentially, a new Nicaraguan government set up a school, a national school for the deaf, and the deaf students started to develop a sign language.
Yeah, I think this was the story that they were talking about on Radio Lab. Yeah.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
So as far as best practices are concerned, getting back to your original question, so basically you have to decide what the psychology of your character or the animal is going to be, and then try to develop the human characteristics that communicate their behavior, but keep it within that framework.
Yeah. And consider your intended audience.
Yeah. And I think it just adds an extra layer of steps basically onto the work that you would normally do in setting up your character and your viewpoints and all that kind of stuff, where like, is this going to be third person, is this going to be third person omniscient, is this going to be third person limited, what is it going to be? And then like decide what, you know, on an extra layer of that is not just like, what does my character want and who are they and all this kind of stuff, but like, how am I going, you know, or like when you're building a magic system in a fantasy world, like you decide how much of that you're going to do. It's kind of the same with the animals. You just decide what the rules are and then stick to that.
Yeah, and there's the one of the problems building a fantasy world is that some writers, do it the same way they would be developing a gaming world, and there's a stock phrase for describing those things, the problems. You can hear the dice rattling.
I got into trouble with the invisible flying pony making assumptions. And actually it was okay because it's a comedy, so I don't have to resolve all these problems. Yeah. But how does a pony play Xbox? It doesn't have thumbs. I got that one. You know, invisible flying pony. Let's start there. I've already crossed the line of what I like what to accept.
Terry Pratchett had to do, where he had to kind of like look at what he'd already written, you know, as he was writing more and more Discworld things, and like, I've already written this, so how do I make this contradict so that it fits the story? And a lot of the time he just
okay, well, let's see. Of course, there's Jack Chalker's way of dealing with problems in the Well World series. I mean, he originally had the Soviet Union system lasting hundreds of years into the future. However, what he did was have his hero push the push the reset button on the universe, essentially.
I guess I had just recently read some stuff kind of with animal point of view stuff, but had to do some research on the body language and, you know, for that stage business, where I did one where it's like kind of a, well, yeah, I guess it'll come out in 2016. Like a woman wearing a bear skin and a woman wearing a fox skin. And when they kind of like dip down, they go into their animal form. And I had to do a lot of research on trying to get some of that, if they're speaking in that form or how they're acting in that form, doing some research about how they're going to move when they're talking or how they're going to move when they do stuff. So you have to think about your physical beats in a different way. But I ended up just watching online videos.
I heard this story once. I think again it was Terry Pratchett, where this boy encounters an alien that's like kind of like a crocodile, you know. And so when he sees the crocodile, to show that he's friendly, he like raises his hands in the air, and, and tries to like smile at him nervously. And of course, when you're a crocodile, you're showing your teeth and baring your claws, you know. So they start attacking him. But yeah, body language is different across species, so that's interesting.
So then you have to take in the known social cues of these animals to. I mean, wolves are a great example. They're highly socialized animals, whereas something like a pocket gopher or a badger is more of a solitary individual. Yeah, cats.
Thank God.
In some respects.
Yeah. And then too, weaving into the gestures and weaving into that stuff, kind of what you mean the first couple of times, and like later on you can just throw it in and people know that means this. But I kind of did want to, I wove in kind of what they were trying to mean by their body language or whatever, and then just left it out after a while, hoping that the reader would just pick up on the fact that they're just going back, and of course context and all that kind of stuff help too.
It all gets complicated when you're wanting your animal characters to do human
Yeah.
things. Like if they have a gun, do they strap it over
Like
their waist?
Xbox.
Like, how does that work?
Yeah.
Like, Tina, a woman in our East St. Paul group, has a spider or like a arachnoid.
Yeah, some insectoid alien type thing.
And so, she has to think about how the arms move, the many arms.
Yeah.
And what.
Where are the many arms when she's like bringing back whatever?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think that can be some of the fun though too, coming up with interesting ways of doing that stuff.
Okay, this is a digression. I realized a while ago that I would find it extremely hard to write from the point of view of a right-handed character.
Why?
What?
Why?
Are you left-handed?
Yes.
There you go.
But it probably isn't true for all left-handed people, but...
Well, if I were to write from the viewpoint of a left-handed person being a total righty, I would just have to visualize that, like you do if I try to visualize a murderer, or, I'm not going to go out and kill somebody, find out what it feels like.
Yeah, okay, well, it's... Certainly, and let's see, well, it probably helps if you wanted to kill somebody every now and then.
I know how that feels.
That's just, you're packing the marketing right into the book.
Yeah,
Exactly. Write the book.
It's like that documentary.
But I would find it easier, but it is, and okay, I would find it easier to write from the viewpoint of a female character than of a right-handed male character.
Does that come into play much though? Like,
what?
Does the right hand, left hand come into play much though?
No, it doesn't.
Like maybe if they're holding a weapon or
Yeah, or
I'm trying to find a scissors that works.
It isn't something that really matters in anything I've written, but I have no idea. But it was weird to figure it out.
I think when writers do that though, when they take things that they clearly aren't, like an arachnid, and they're able to come up with these interesting, that shows that they put some thought into the character and the story, and that's kind of what I'm looking for when I pick up a story about an arachnid. I don't, unless it's a comedy and it could be any creature that the creature isn't important, where if I'm reading a story where the arachnid's the main character, I want to see clever things that you've done with it. That's going to impress me, whereas if you just write it like a normal person, it doesn't seem to be any different than. There's a phrase in the, what is it called, a werewolf with a cape or something like that. I think you told me this, or was that the group you were in where we talked about where your person is just, your protagonist is just a human, but you made them werewolves, give them superpowers, and you just basically give them a cape. It doesn't matter if they're a werewolf. Just they needed some method of being super uber, and you just gave them.
There has to be a reason.
There's got to be a reason for
them
it.
to be a werewolf or an arachnid or a rabbit or
right. And if you can make that play into the story, and make it important somehow, it's going to impress people more.
When my oldest daughter was in middle school, she was reading a ton of Animorphs. And I thought, well, I better find out what that's all about. So I read like 8. I was going to read 1, but they were good. I read 8, so. But they were excellent, I thought, the way they did the whole human being in the body of a mosquito or a mole or a tiger or whatever, and kind of losing themselves in that mentality and having to fight to stay human enough to get back out of it.
And the alien who struggled with being human every once in a while.
That too, yes.
If you
And
guys
he was
haven't
a
read them,
composite.
the aliens have no sense of taste. So when he, morphed into a human and tried things, he was like overwhelmed by the experience.
Sure.
Well, we talked about biology or genetics, the physical form of the characters, the psychology and the social aspect, social structure, but we never really hit upon the spirituality or the fantasy of the characters. You know, if they're in
Like
a
how do they
social,
see themselves, yeah.
how do they see their own spirituality?
Yeah, what's their cosmology like?
Yeah.
One thing I read about an actual animal is this gorilla, I think it was, that they taught the sign language, and she had a big vocabulary. They said the one thing that you could count on was that if it served her purposes, she would lie like a rug.
I am shocked.
Yeah. And based on that, I've seen some film of chimpanzees like in groups where if you give them a mask,
Yeah.
they are like they just kind of let go of their morals. They put the mask on and they do whatever they want to the other chimpanzees, and when they take the mask off, they have to behave.
Yeah.
So the idea that I'm somebody else right now.
Yeah. Well, what they did with her
Explains the
is
internet.
put a doll or something that she liked, a toy, in their cage with her, and then left and told her, don't touch it. Well, she couldn't help herself, of course. As soon as they got out of sight, she grabbed it and was petting it and playing with it. And they came back, and as soon as they walked in the door, she tossed it on the floor.
Have you ever had a dog?
Look
Like
at
our
it.
dog, whenever she'd get in the garbage, she would get really guilty and like try to hide and all this different stuff. So yeah, I think that's something that like.
They told her, we saw you pick it up. No, I didn't. And they said, we'll show you a picture. They showed her pictures. They showed her a video of her playing with it. Nope, that wasn't me. I would never do that.
That's funny.
There was the child that fell in the gorilla zoo in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And
I
one of
remember
the
that.
mother gorillas picked it up and was petting it and caring for it
Yep.
for, a good
And then went
half an
over-
hour or something like that.
She went over and sat next to the door where the keepers come in, and
Right.
held it until they came and got it.
Yeah.
I guess
Nobody
it's
else-
interesting.
There's like mirror neurons
Oh,
or
yeah.
whatever, like where they reflect back what, they're shown.
Yeah.
So, that kind
Well,
of plays
plus, just some things
part into
universal,
it.
like maternity.
Yeah,
Maternity feelings are across the board. That's why you can give baby squirrels to cats, and they raise them with their kittens.
Interestingly, though, I think that it's a really interesting question, like what the morality of a animal would be, just because, like, for example, I know in like gorillas, for example, they one of the ways that the way their social structure works is like the alpha gorilla will have like a bunch of females, kind of like lions. And then like if a younger gorilla wants to come in, one way he can do that is by fighting the older gorilla and defeating them, or he can try and convince one of the females to leave the gorilla by showing her that he's not strong enough to protect her child by killing her child. Which is like, I don't know if I would get with someone who killed my baby, but apparently I gotta take this 1 second.
Yeah, their social structure, the baboons, they're assholes. Baboons
But
are
on the other hand, if a baboon
that's
comes
exactly
across,
Actually, dolphins are too.
if a baby
They're-
baboon dies, like falls off a cliff or something where he didn't want to kill it,
Yeah.
they will grieve over it. Even the alpha baboons in a troop will grieve over a dead baby.
Just like elephants, they would also grieve and
Yeah.
also carry
And the
bones
gorillas,
of
yeah.
their deceased.
But if you notice that we're all talking about mammals.
That's true.
Right, yeah. I had an iguana, and my kids just swore he was friendly. I said, your ears long, that's what he wants.
But
That's a good point.
So what's the difference between, mammals and other,
Well, the primary difference is because we often too often portray reptiles as the baddest and the cuddly, sweet and feathery birds and mammals as the protagonists. I'm tired of that crap.
Ender's Game is one that comes up to me in response response to your point, is one of the few that like is a classic about miscommunication between species, because that's these hive of evil insects, and it's all based on miscommunication, the whole war, and I don't want to give anything away, but there's, I mean, that series gets much more philosophical
Which
as
series
it goes
is that?
on. Ender's Game.
Yeah, once you get into like Speaker for the Dead and the Xenocide and stuff.
Yeah, right. So it's the guilt over that miscommunication. I don't think that's giving anything away, but it's a very, that is something that I, once communication is established, then the protagonist realizes, oh my gosh, you know, and they are very thinking, and that's one of the few that I have read, at least, that delves into the different species ways of thinking, particular hive mentalities, which are more socialist in nature. Not to say they're not ruthless either, but
Right. But it is a completely different mentality.
Yep.
These large groups of insects that work almost as a single entity, whereas you have, you know, mammals or other creatures that act, you know, independently in their own self-interest.
They've been discovering these extremophiles underground too, which are very fascinating too. Some new studies, they're a couple miles below, and there's whole ecosystems that are completely collaborative, and there's no predators in them, for example. And yet there's cross-species cooperation between different organisms. I mean, it's new stuff coming up.
Organisms?
They're very small, but you see that even a little bit in those undersea vents, those deep sea vents. Those are somewhat collaborative also, where there's cross-species cooperation between like corals and bacteria or fungi or whatever type of thing. And so that's very simplistic organisms, but it's kind of interesting, like I said, a collaborative ecosystem, cross-species to me. Right, how to play that would be very interesting. I haven't read, has anybody read a book that really gets into that, or?
There's there used to be science fiction stories in which you had humans who were raised with no microorganisms. It turns out that the humans, the human body is actually a collaborative ecosystem.
That's very, your digestive tract in particular.
What?
Yeah.
Your digestive tract in particular.
Even your eyelashes. You know, you get worms in the follicles of your eyelashes.
Oh, thanks for that detail.
I mean, the current estimate is that something like 60% of your body weight is like non-human cells.
I thought it was 60% of your cells.
When does that diet book come out? 60% of your weight?
Yeah, there you go. And
Copyright.
also a certain a fair number of what is your your cells. It is descended from microbes of one kind or another.
So what happens if you have a mutiny?
What?
Well, I mean, they don't. They die too.
So this is true.
Which, I mean, isn't to say, I mean, that's essentially how you get deadly diseases, something killing off its host.
Well, they wouldn't want to kill you, just take over.
Well, that's what's interesting though. There are some that are, you could argue, are bad, like Ebola. It kills you perhaps too quickly. You know what I mean? Versus like the flu, where heck, it doesn't kill you.
But that's not a symbiote, that's an infection.
Infection.
So
true, yeah, we got the virus.
Yeah.
Well, no, but some viruses don't only kill a small
that's
percentage, like the flu.
There was
Or
a story.
herpes that just sort of stays in a person's body and doesn't do anything.
But
it's really, really successful.
in the case of the flu or a cold, it's because of your own defense system that keeps it down, not because it doesn't want to multiply.
There's truth to that too.
So it's a war.
Yeah.
It's war.
Actually, there is. This came out about a year or two ago, but this guy did a study about a cross-species virus between cats and humans, and you get the virus, and it changes your behavior. Literally, changes your DNA and your behavior to actually allow this virus to. I think it is you either like your cat more or something like that, or it's something that look it up. I wish I'm going off the top of my head here, but
Toxoplasmosis, I think.
I'm sorry, what?
I think it's toxoplasmosis.
That term I won't
I've
testify
heard
to
that
that,
term. My brother does animal control, and that's a big thing, because like it's a big problem if you have a sandbox in the backyard for your kids, you go to the cupboard, raccoons will get in there and get in, play in it.
So your house.
And then your kid, or your cat, and then your kids go in there and play and they get that, they can get that.
What would you call it?
That's why pregnant women-
Toxoplasmosis, yeah.
Okay,
It's
that's
also
like
why
zoonotic
pregnant women
disease, it
should
might be the
not
same thing, and
clean our litter box.
Toxoplasmosis.
Yeah.
David Brin actually wrote a short story or a novelette or something called The Giving Plague. And it was about these two guys who discover a virus that's become so sophisticated that instead of like vectoring through sneezing or whatever, it specifically targets blood transfusions. It can't be detected on any of the normal screenings, and it's just this weird thing where like after you give blood, you feel better than before you did, and so it encourages people to go out and give blood and spread it that way.
And the flu makes you more social. You actually want to go out and interact with people. They studied that too.
Really?
Yeah, it changes your behavior.
Yeah,
That virus, the flu,
there are all
changes
sorts
your
of
behavior.
parasites who change the behavior of their host to accommodate their own reproductive cycle.
Okay.
You know, like we'll make certain critters say jump in the water when it will drown, but that's where the pest needs to be to
The next life cycle
reproduce.
stage or whatever,
Yep.
yeah, okay.
So,
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I mean, I mean, that one's kind of weird, especially given that we know of a lot more cases of like behavioral modification, as he said.
right.
But I mean, in that particular case, the idea is that they try and study it clandestinely because they're planning on like getting a Nobel Prize and don't want to tell anyone about it. And eventually they end up covering it up because they find out that people infected with it are just generally nicer people. Like they don't commit violent crimes and a bunch of other stuff like that. They assume it's essentially reverse psychology. Like they ask, you know, why do you give blood so often? And it's like, well, it's because I'm a nice person. And so they're just acting better as a result of it. And I mean, there's this, but
Yeah, you can't keep track of all the variables.
yeah, but I mean, the idea with that is that the body. I mean, essentially, it's moving into being completely symbiotic at that point. And
I just read an article the other day that said that they did a study where they had owners of animals gaze into their eyes, dogs. And when they gazed into their dog's eyes and were affectionate, it raised the oxytocin levels in both of them like 300%, which makes you more friendly and more outgoing and more bonded. It's what makes mothers bond with babies. So they did that experiment with cats. It was minimal. They did it with wolves. People who had raised wolves from pups, non-existent. So just dogs.
Oh, I could do it with a wound.
Maybe.
Well, of course, there is a thing that established domestic animal pets. Yeah, pet species tend to become more infantile.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep. Their dogs behave like wolf pups. And once the wolf grows up and isn't a pup anymore, they don't act like dogs anymore. You know, so, and then there was
Well, you have to define what dogs are. I mean, they are very social, I think as Tim brought up though.
Right, but
you know,
they're,
amongst themselves.
right, but they're still canids, you know, like wolves. It's just the difference between what domestication has done to them at whatever point. Okay, case in point, in Russia, Siberia, some guy was raising foxes for fur, blue foxes. And he found that if some of them that retained that more juvenile trait were easier to handle, which was better for his business. So he bred that in. Unfortunately, when that happened, those wolves never got to, or foxes never got to fox maturity. They acted like dogs, and their colors started to mutate. which was bad for business. They started to be more like dogs. They were diversifying and being different. So he had to go back to make them wild again, so he could have that blue pelt. So.
And of course, the humans have been domesticated by other humans, but
Or we domesticated ourselves.
yeah.
I don't know that if it's domestication or just cooperation.
Well, the whole dog-human thing, if we were talking about symbiotic relationships,
Yeah.
that started as this, I actually just saw this on Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about it. But that started as a symbiotic relationship back when we were, nomads. It was beneficial to have packs of, then wolves around. They would keep off other predators, and then they would eat the scraps of the kill that the humans made. And it was a nice symbiotic relationship that just kind of evolved.
I guess if we're willing to take this off and look at a different direction, because it's about critters in general. I guess I was going to bring up the concept of the create your own or use one of the established. So how many more dragon stories do there need to be, or do you make your own creature?
And will that serve the plot or not? Why do you need to make it different from an already existing creature?
Yeah.
Right.
Well-
I will say, why didn't you just write about a dragon? This is a dragon that you gave it.
I mean, just, in comparison, I mean, we recently, Minicon, like just about the first talk in that was Brandon Sanderson going on. I mean, it was mostly about magic systems, but one of the things that he brought up was that he felt that there was this massive dearth of original settings and original creatures and that kind of stuff along with them. That, I mean, yes, dragons are wonderful, but I mean, like, if you go and have a giant crab monster instead, they're not going to say, oh, that's just a dragon. That, I mean, it's going to be something genuinely, it isn't even all that new. I mean, it's a crab, it's very large, but I mean, at the same time, I mean, you hear that and you're like, I mean, when was the last time I saw a fantasy novel where, like they went out and hunted giant crabs? It doesn't happen all that often.
Is that because of the medium? They talk about the medium, where a picture's worth 1,000 words, and so, to describe this crab creature, which none of us have ever seen, might take pages to do, or, that story being told as a film, they could do CGI and boom, you instantly realize what it is. Did they talk about that at all, or?
No,
the medium of your story?
Writers do tend to kind of luxuriate in their descriptions of their creatures, even if they're established ones.
Okay, let's see. There are two recent stories in which unicorns are carnivorous.
Cool. Was one of them cabin in the woods or something?
What?
Was one of them cabin in the woods?
No, no. That's not. They are the Equoid Plague by Charles Strauss, which is a novel published as a book alone, and Foxglove Summer by Ben Aranovich.
Oh yeah.
Which Aranovich's protagonist is head of the magical branch of the London police force. And
good book. I just read that one too.
Yeah,
it's like urban fantasy, but in London.
Yeah, actually,
with police procedure. But that one actually goes out in the countryside.
Yes, and there's one in which finally, one of the things that I found slightly irritating about the earlier series is that there are these two women that he keeps almost going to bed with, and in this one, he does get one of them.
Yeah.
But, I mean, even with the unicorns, that's certainly a novel take on them. I mean, aside from the fact that apparently two people came up with the idea at around the same time. But, I mean, like, when's the last time you saw unicorns played straight in, like, modern fantasy? And I mean, I think this is sort of part of the issue, is that, I mean, they were these big staples, but, I mean, they're done to death. I mean, you know, I mean, I suppose if you watch My Little Pony, I mean, I do, but, you know, it's, I mean, it's not common, certainly.
Yeah, you kind of have to go back to Peter Beagle.
Yeah.
Last Unicorn is like the last really good, just straight up.
And I mean, I think that's sort of where we're going. I mean, you get to the point where, you know, I mean, I think we even had a meeting dealing with something along the lines of vampires or something along those lines. I mean, you just have these things and they go through this cycle where, I mean, you come up with all these new ideas and try and take a whole bunch of new angles on them, and then you run out of new angles.
Yeah.
And so you just get rid of them. And so, I mean,
I guess I had a friend who suggested, like, as soon as you start seeing the spoofs, that's when that's been played out. Because it's all they can think of now is the joke.
I mean, like Huck Finn and Zombie Jim?
Yeah.
That's a book?
Yes.
Is it the same as, you know, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies?
I don't
publisher, probably.
Yeah.
There
I
was
think
a
it's
big wave of them for a
Abraham
while.
Lincoln's
Yeah, let's see, has anyone done a story in which it turns out that ordinary humans were bred as a food source for vampires?
Oh, I was going to say the
Oh, I think
Matrix.
that's
Daybreakers?
What?
Yeah.
Daybreakers, wasn't it?
Matrix is not for vampires.
yeah,
but
that
The one
was-
Ethan Hawke?
I'm reading one right now.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
I
where-
think
Yeah,
you might be
there's a
right.
movie
There's a
about
degree
that.
of that in the
Vampires were
stress of
not
her
so much
regard
more
as
in
well.
modern times,
Is there?
but-
I haven't read it all the way
Yeah,
through that
that's
one.
Well,
nice.
I mean, it's just because the vampires are, like, I mean, this is, I don't remember how exactly the book developed, but the vampires in the stress of her regard are like millions of years older than humans. I mean, because they're a completely different species. I mean, they predate like carbon-based life on Earth. And
That's early.
yeah,
Tim Powers is
they're
really worth reading in general,
Actually,
yeah.
let's see, yeah, for fantasy and science fiction, I
What
think
did they eat before?
One
they
of-
like ones?
the answer to the question, has this idea has been used, is probably.
Yeah. I don't know if that's necessarily a deterrent.
Everybody says everything's been done, sure it
Yeah.
has, you know, but do it different, do it better.
Run it by a few people and see if they get bored.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know. I think it's got to be a lot more of sort of a practical type of thing, like Margaret just said. Because I mean, you know, yes, it's all fine and good to say, you know, it's been done before, but you know, try and put your own spin on it. But I mean, you know, I mean, you know, we've been having this conversation about all of these ideas that, I mean, at least from a scientific standpoint, we just hadn't known anything about, you know, even 5 years ago. And it seems like you ought to be able to come up with something interesting and reasonably original from those, instead of just, you know, going back and, you know, I mean, going through old tropes and making them more cliche.
I don't believe in cliche.
Well, you can't deny it's out there.
I believe that if something's been used often, find another use for it.
Exactly.
I think sometimes it's easy just to grab the vampire off the shelf, drop it into your story, and if you're being, so where do I need to narrow? If you're only focused on the story or the love affair or the gunfight at the end, and it just needs a zombie or a
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
we'll just grab that off the shelf and drop it in, because then you don't have to make stuff up.
You don't have to worry.
I guess.
Yeah.
The hard work.
I often find too often that just vampires and
Got the cape
zombies are often just excuses to make the story just as violent as possible.
Right, yep.
And that's actually why, I'm nervous to say this, but that's actually why I hate anti-Twilight people. Well, one of the reasons, actually, because they want vampires to just be excuses for people to be as violent as possible. So my response is, grow up, you idiotic man-children.
I don't know. I mean, it's not as if there isn't violence going on in the Twilight books.
Well, obviously there is.
Sometimes the
Well,
villains are
I
just
mean-
metaphors for, you know, it allows you to talk about, you know, prisons or, you know, caste systems or whatever you want to talk
I can
about.
write something pretty dang violent with just two people alone in a room.
And that kind
So,
of
you
gets
know.
back to the topic too. I mean, when you use animals in your stories, is it just to use it as a metaphor for some greater thing that's happening in your story?
Right.
So is by making your main character a wolf that does X more impactful, because a human doing X doesn't have the historical context or connotations that a specific animal would have for a story.
Or it's too on the nose or too controversial, like children's literature. They use, you know, animals a lot as a metaphor because it's too violent. Or even like if you've seen Moss, for example, that graphic novel, it's about the Holocaust, but he makes the Jews the mice and the Nazis cats.
That's a great example.
You know, yeah.
The Americans are dogs, the
Yeah,
Poles are
yeah,
pigs.
right, exactly. That's right. Yeah, I forgot about the other species that they use too. Kind of like an Animal Farm type of a thing too. So, yeah, I agree that's one that can be really cool if done well.
Let's see, just thinking, I keep thinking that there really ought to be a book entitled Vegetable Farm.
You go to bed first. Just go
What?
for it.
The vegetables are people?
Well, yeah.
Yes, there's.
Vegetables are people too.
Oh, the details, you know, the details is doing that.
Of course, and certainly there was a.
Cooks a rabbit.
And let's see, there was a story in which on another world the intelligent species was vegetable, and vegetable derived, and it turns out that there is a vampire equivalent, and he has been living on other people's sap. And the end of the story, the last line is they buried him with a stake through his heart.
Oh, that kind of steak.
What?
So it reminds me of Vernacular, where they try to kill the vampire by trying to put a beefsteak into his heart.
Yeah.
Well,
There's Heart Failure.
Terry Faust, who's another member of this group, for anybody who doesn't know, he's written a book called His Xenophobe, and the protagonists in that are plant-based.
Really?
Yep.
What was
Yeah,
that?
Z is for xenophobe.
On the other hand,
It's fun. It's not, it's fun.
I read a science fiction story a long time ago, I don't remember the name, where an author took this idea and did it really badly. I mean, a bunch of people just crash land on a planet, and lots of mysterious things happen, and they finally figure out that the trees are sentient. And then nothing comes of it because the trees can't move or do anything.
Nobody cares.
The whole thing fell flat. That was the end of the story.
Terrible.
Interesting idea, poorly executed.
Yeah.
There is a series of books written by George Mann, I think. And there's some historical figures that are, you know, wrapped up in the storyline, but I stopped reading it because it basically devolved. And in this story, as the series progresses, these plants become more and more sentient to the point of, you know, World War I is just this humongous biological warfare between the Germans and the, you know, that group of individuals, and then the Allied powers, and it, where they're basically pitting these, you know, plant weapons against each other, and it just got really,
Well, truthfully, if you think
really fruity, exhausting.
Yeah. If you think about it, the two biggest organisms on Earth are a fungus and a timber pine forest. So that are totally connected. But
I don't know, I thought it was an aspen grove after the.
I heard of those,
yeah, I thought, the one I read was fungus #1 and #2 was the pines.
Yeah, you brought up something there too about plants communicating. There's more and more data that's coming out where they're through hormones or smells that they give off. It causes them to react mainly to, I think, like insects or diseases will trigger immune responses or some type of sap production or something. in other trees as a defense
Plants
mechanism.
gotta live too.
This brings up this brings up something that I've actually created for, once again, natural legends. But you know how some species lack brains, like starfish or even plants in general? Well, and therefore they cannot actually think well. And if your story demands that this is not, and if the story you build demands that this is not possible, well, the best option is find another way to do that. Like, for example, in Natural Legends, I made it so that creatures like starfish or plants actually do have minds, but they're not biological or inside their bodies. They are spiritual and exist within their souls.
So how do they communicate?
Telepathy.
Okay.
I think it'd be interesting to write a character that has like a decentralized nervous system, like a sea sponge, that it's just all everywhere.
You know,
would it think differently? If it doesn't
beheading
think
wouldn't
in
necessarily
just
kill
one
them.
place? Yeah, it might just take away part of them, which
Yeah.
would also be interesting.
Which could regenerate.
And then they'd be like a slightly different person afterwards, maybe.
Yeah. Cool.
Like, there's lots of animals that are very simplistic that have like a neurological net instead of a actual brain. So then how would you play that off in writing as well?
Well, you could try what I did.
It would be very different.
But how would you, unless you're writing something like lit fic or lit fantasy, you can't have a protagonist. You can have a protagonist that has a different kind of brain, but not one that really can't move.
Right.
And there's so much action.
You have to have something happen. Plus, they have to be able to have some sort of emotion. Otherwise, you're reading about a flat character that.
Right.
That's
Unless they're meant to not have emotions.
Well, it would have to have a rebound effect.
You can get away with a
where-
Spock, for instance.
Yeah.
But even he breaks down.
Right.
I always had
much
trouble
more
with
interesting.
Spock and Data both. You know, they just don't quite pull it off. You know, you really, that would be so difficult.
Well, aren't they
They're
meant to be though?
non-emotional.
That's like more of an ensemble cast, and they're each representing different facets of the human.
Right, but if they don't give them some
mind.
kind of humanity, then nobody cares about them. You know, so
can
you have to contradict yourself in order to make it work.
Yeah,
So I
something
wouldn't go
like
there.
trees, forest. Going in, the protagonist would be kind of getting a response from like the island, not the island. What's that TV
ruins?
show? What's the TV show?
Lost.
Lost, where the island is talking back to them a little bit. And then it's kind of like the more they're involved with the island, the more signs and more things, mysteries happen as it gradually, you know, escalates up to the character or the plot thickens. And then,
So it's so confusing we can't understand.
The creators.
yeah.
I think it was meant to be, and it's meant to be confusing. You're supposed to.
Lost is, yeah, definitely. But I'm
Well,
just saying,
yeah, let's
you
not
know,
talk about,
just,
that's a good digression there, that'd be.
all right.
Yeah.
No, not, yeah, I mean about like, did they actually know what they were doing at the end? of
Oh,
Lost?
yeah. But I'm just saying, you know, signs, symbols, mysteries, what have you.
Yeah, they played up very well, that miscommunication that is
Oh.
happening, you know, is part of the mystery
I
of,
gotcha.
you know, not doing the big dump right at the front, like here's all the exposition up front. I mean, part of the fun of that whole series is the mystery of what is going on here. It's the island, it's another
People went nuts
something.
online, you know,
Right,
trying to.
conspiracy, what is it, what's
Yeah.
going on, right? So really, that was a great writing device that they chose to do, and
Heck yeah.
by denying information, it created, I mean, incredible suspense.
And I've also noticed that, this brings me to a problem I've noticed with a lot of viewers these days, is that they just want everything spoon-fed to them. They don't want to think, and they don't want to be challenged. They just want everything to just be a dumb little story where everything is explained to them, and they can get spoon-fed, and they can probably walk away even more stupid than they.
Well, there was a great discussion about fluff, I mean, you can get into this debate here, but I don't know if you read that fluff fiction was talked about, where there, I wouldn't agree with your statement when you say a generalization, which we all do, saying everybody. But there is a spectrum, maybe you're, not a big fan of fluff fiction, but there was a really good defense of fluff fiction. here a couple months ago about why some people might like what you're not a fan of.
Yeah, but I find that
I'm not saying I'm a fan of fluff fiction, but there was a really good discussion about that.
So what's an example of like a, you know, a prototypical flush fiction? Or
Fluff fiction was the
pretty much
term.
any.
well, maybe flush was a Freudian slip in that way. But
Pretty much every Disney movie.
Yeah.
I don't think Disney is flawed.
No, that wasn't what was thrown up. It was more, was anybody there help me out here? What was some of the discussion on the fluff fiction?
I was kind of in a haze.
The nutritional equivalent of a Hershey bar.
Yeah, it's not meant to be. Yeah, it could be not a lot of social commentary going on. It's just kind of a real,
Like life in
no big
Mayberry.
character arcs. It's, yeah, sitcom. There is no character arc. It's just the same characters getting in the same trouble.
And
Yeah.
watch a single episode.
Just yeah, it's just like okay, and tomorrow the same thing, different problem. Same people, different problem.
Oh yeah, those are those ones where like you've had a really hard day at work, you just want to switch off your brain, and that's it. You're exposed to something. It's okay. You might like it, but it doesn't really do anything.
Is it okay if we drop back to your comment from like 10 minutes ago about creating your own characters?
Yeah.
I don't know if you really fleshed that out much, and I'm interested in this because when is it appropriate to create your own character? And I know it can just be a distraction.
Yeah, I guess I came up with like I just had a title pop into my head one day, Crackle Bones, and it was about a creature who ate the bone marrow. So it has to crack through your bones, and I just kind of had to design what that would look like. And I knew that the protagonist of the story was going to be riding on the creature, and I didn't want it to be like a four-legged thing. So it was this kind of like big hulking thing, like a harness on the back.
Did you model it after an existing animal?
I had seen something a little bit similar in a comic book. It was a Ted Nafee comic. It was a Courtney Crumrin book. And if you haven't read any of Ted Nafee stuff, the Courtney Crumrin stuff is freaking awesome. But no, and that was one of those things where like, I kind of seen some pictures of like, well, that's kind of similar to what I want to do. But that was one of the other things I was going to bring in as another layer of that conversation is the idea that, well, yeah, my aliens are cat people or snake people or squid people, or do you go all the way into like Larry Niven, or if you go back and look at like Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials, you're going to see just so many examples of just like that kind of stuff. But yeah, I guess the idea that I think it's really fun to come up with that stuff, but I think it's exceedingly difficult to come up with your own thing.
So your creature walks on its back legs?
Yeah, 2 legs. When it's climbing, it has like really, really long arms that will reach the ground.
So does it hop like a kangaroo, or does it walk like a T-Rex?
It's kind of more walking like a gorilla would, where sometimes it's up and walking, and sometimes if it's going to run, and its back is probably almost higher than its head, so its head would be down a little bit. Just with like a really huge jaw and just really big hands to rip the bones out of people.
Related to this, actually, I'm wondering if more, original, for lack of a better term, original critters happens more in science fiction than fantasy, where fantasy might rely a lot on, let's throw a vampire in there, I don't have to worry about backstory and all that fun stuff. The world building is less. With fantasy sometimes, even if it's a hard fantasy on another planet or something, they're still using dragons and orcs or something like that. So that's a question for the group then, or maybe related to you. Like
I've invented some original.
No, I'm not saying you don't, but in general, as a generalization, there's exceptions. Or you might do different takes on a carnivorous unicorn, But is science fiction do more original monsters or critters than fantasy?
I think in general they do.
I think science fiction readers demand it. Like,
Yeah.
they don't want to see another Martian with green skin and a giant brain sticking out.
Yeah.
I like that. That might sum the whole thing up. You can do it, but yeah, in sci-fi you have to almost.
Part of that story is the learning about the creature, like in Alien. We don't. What is it? We don't know what it is up front. And as we learn more about it, we get more. The more you learn about this thing, the more you want to kill it.
At first either.
And the creature itself doesn't show for a lot of the movie.
Yeah, it is. That's brilliant.
And so if that's part of what you're, part of the creature that you've created, if we're not going to, did you reveal a vampire over time? That would be kind of a mystery.
With fantasy, it tends to be more around warping some kind of myth.
Yeah.
mythos that are already out there, and you just decide how you're gonna warp it to fit your own world. There's very little, I think, in fantasy, to the extent anyway that there is in science fiction, where you just start from the ground up and build a new one.
So I guess where I was coming from was more of a mystery, the mystery of what this creature is and what it does. If you're creating your own new thing that we haven't seen before, then that's...
I think you could do that in both
You can do
science
it in
fiction
both,
and
yeah.
fantasy.
Yeah, but for
But I think it
monsters,
is
that was a
done
great
more in
example.
science fiction.
Monsters is a great way to
So
do
whether,
it.
and if you're just coming out up front with, here it is, me and my crime fighting buddy, the dragon.
Image.
Well, what a shadow alien.
And then I did some changes.
That is
And then like
fantasy or science fiction?
That depends. If
Yeah,
you need to
beefy
know
stuff,
some
it's just-
science, it has to
So I was
resolve
kind of
itself
going
in
more
the
for
physical
almost
world.
like
If
Okay.
you're never learning on magic or
fantasy creature.
something like that, then it would be science fiction. If you're not explaining the
It's
science,
more
then
stories
it's
that
soft
would-
science
that's all.
fiction.
All
So
right.
if
Gonna steal the creature, but
if you're getting into string theory, then it's hard fiction. Science fiction.
All right. Because my idea coming here was just, kind of learning and just sitting in and just kind of absorbing a little bit because I don't know a whole lot about this genre. That's why I've been a little bit quiet. I don't know if you guys have been wondering that, about me. But I'm not, here to fetch ideas or anything off you guys. I was just here to, understand a little bit more about genres that you guys are throwing out.
Sometimes
A lot
the more you learn about it,
a
the
lot
more
about
confusing it
artists
is.
or authors and books, and it just seems like you guys are way ahead of the curve from where I'm at, so I didn't want to interrupt too much. You guys are going off way ahead of me.
Actually, your blog had the great thing on the magical realism is, the comments that were kind of made. Sometimes we throw out terms and it's just kind of a fad. Perhaps sometimes it is a new genre completely, and that is fascinating. But it is, that's why I come here too, is just to learn more from each other. We've all read stuff. There's so much out there to share that, and not only good reading lists, but just to learn more about all the distinctions. It's a big learning curve.
It sounds like it. I mean, I'm like...
Well, sometimes
not
learning the
even
lines
a
between those
toe in.
distinctions is the good part.
Yeah, I'm not even a foot in. I'm like a toe in, so
Well,
no worries.
But if you're a real fan of fiction, the one thing that I always hear is good writing advice is read a lot, especially, even outside of your genre. But let's say you're going to write a story about something that's not a werewolf. Well, make sure you read all about the werewolves before you try to write the not a werewolf, so that you're not falling into the genre trap that a lot of people. They'll be allergic to silver bullets. Won't that be great? Sorry.
Done before.
I'll tell you this, but
Welcome to Earth.
Right.
I think you've heard that when you were a kid, right? It's
Scott
probably
Lynch
stuck
said
with you a little bit.
He started to write and couldn't get past like 3 paragraphs. Then he didn't write anything for 10 years, but he read prodigiously.
Right.
And then when he got ready to write a novel, he was ready to do it. And all that reading was what got him ready to do that.
Plus, we had a speaker one time who said that you can tell sometimes if someone's researched a topic with just like a single source, because they bring up a certain detail that was like the focus of whatever that book was. I think it was what's her name? She wrote the book that was kind of a fantasy based around Tombstone and the
Gemma Files?
Emma Bowl with Territory?
Yes, that's who it was. She said that there's been lots of books written on that subject in particular, the shootout at the OK Corral. So when she's read stories about stuff that revolves around just as an example, that particular event, she can almost pinpoint the book that they read to do their research, because all these books have like one particular thing that they focus on.
And there's a book that just came out, I think it's a nonfiction book, that talks about the shootout at the OK Corral. It's all this chain of one bad source or whatever. It was not the shootout was not at the OK Corral.
No, it was in the...
Period.
Because it doesn't...
Yeah, so it's a great
The shootout at
example.
the OK Corral sounds a lot better than the shootout in the vacant lot next to the lumberyard.
Yes, exactly right.
maybe that was taken.
Yeah.
See, everything's been done.
Wrong labeling,
Well,
titles.
on a smaller level too, you gotta be careful that you do your homework, because I read this series that was long, she finally wrapped it up, very popular fantasy series, and contemporary fantasy. And she had, her protagonist was turned into a ferret. The problem was she didn't realize that a ferret is a carnivore, and she had it be a rodent. They're not rodents, they eat rodents. So it took, as long as it takes to write a book and then get it published, it was like 3 books later by the time she said, everybody knows ferrets are not rodents. You know? And I'm sure she got a lot of flack from everybody who's ever had one, you know, so.
That's
I
great.
didn't
Good
know
editor
right
too,
there.
right? Didn't have multiple people failed in that case.
Yeah.
Not only the editor, the publisher, all along.
Oh,
Beta
yeah.
readers, having good beta readers.
Yep.
To, you know, in that know that field at least.
Yeah, I
So
felt
save
the
you
pain, I'll
embarrassment.
tell you.
Yeah.
And
What if-
Stephen King is one who said he hates to do research and it bites him in the butt regularly. You know, so.
What if you were taking research like, I went to a party last night and it was between 2 sides of my family, and I was put in the middle of it, and I was like a shadow alien, you know. I would put myself, you know, as a shadow alien, and these were the populations, the humans, you know, looking for me to entertain them. Just a short story, you know, just to put up on the internet, you know, for the group.
That might be interesting.
Might be interesting, or
Yeah.
probably not.
It's all about the execution.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Any idea can sound awesome.
Yeah.
Any idea can sound
I'm
awesome.
just
but if
throwing
you-
it out
yeah.
there to get a critique, you know, go off of for next week, or if that doesn't sound good,
Well, you
maybe
heard
I
what
step
Conrad
out.
wrote. You know,
Yeah.
the sky's the limit.
Yeah, you just gotta write it and
Yeah,
be open to the critique.
yeah.
Which I guess
Make
is
it
the subject of
interesting.
next month.
So I guess, has anybody really created their own creatures for stuff that aren't based on, well, this is a cat, or this is some kind of...
exploding spider leeches.
Yeah. But I mean, that's all a combination
And the
of...
name came first, so I had to
Yeah.
figure out why do they explode, right?
But that's also a combination of
It's a good
anything.
Yeah,
story.
that's how I was just gonna make that.
You know, I was gonna
right.
say, without, and with no
Terms
chimeras
that we already
either.
know.
Right.
You know, no,
Say just
it's a
work.
this,
Right.
this,
Right.
and that, you know, but like a completely original creature that's not pieced together from other creatures.
Yeah, like a wumpus. You look at a wumpus, you know,
Yeah.
type of an example.
I've got
I
one
can-
in a short story that I've written that's alien, but he's like a snake, but he can make arms, fingers, legs, whatever he needs for whatever he needs to do. So that was interesting to write that, you know, and try and figure out how he thinks. Like, his spaceship crashed, and I was waiting for my car while the mechanic was fixing it, so he was my protag. First thing he was doing was
Because you
brushing
really
the snow
wanted
off
him
my
to
car.
succeed, yeah.
Yeah, and then this alien, you know, that got crashed in the woods comes in under the snow and into his shop and is basically rolling around and manipulating things and hiding because he can camouflage, and then they end up having a philosophical conversation. So, but that was like the mechanic dropped something and he just couldn't figure out why he threw it down and picked it up because he never drops anything. You know, so you know, that's it. I think that's probably the most original thing I've ever written for credits.
It's nice that you gave us the frame of reference right away. It's like a snake.
Yeah.
With arms, and then I could picture that right
The general
away.
torpedo
So
shape.
yeah, it's nice to be able to compare your creature, even if it's fresh and original, to something that we know.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
it's
that's
pretty
hard
hard not to have a
That's always
frame of
a good thing.
reference.
That's the good thing. Find new ways to use older tropes. Like, for example, I haven't picked a book, but I've decided one book ends with one character. I haven't yet decided what species they'll be yet, but you know how in a lot of final battles an evil sorcerer may turn into a snake and you just know he's just dead meat now? Well, this time around, the protagonist is the one who turns into the gigantic snake, and he triumphs.
You had the crab rabbit in your
Oh, yeah, it had a bit part.
Crab rabbit.
And it was a chimera, well, like a chimera, so.
Oh, yeah.
Well, didn't you say too that you would come up with, okay.
I do that a lot, and I know I'm getting a bunch of short stories that I wrote for Nano critiqued, and when I was doing Nano, I was writing really fast. And so when I choose like a dragon, I really like want to participate in that like fantasy tradition, basically. So I don't just grab any animal. So if I can't think of one that really fits the mood or the tone that I want to set, then I'll make it up. And I struggled then going back and trying to name them. Because I had one that I pictured in my head sort of like a boar, and that it was going to attack somebody, and it had a snout, but it was also blind. And then I realized for the rest of the story, after she kills it, she picks it up and carries it on her shoulders all the time. I thought, well, if it looks like a boar, then it'd be difficult for her to carry it. Like, it needs to be more like a deer-like. And so originally the name had the word boar in it, and I just got rid of that word and made up another combination of letters.
Sometimes it's like finding names for stuff going, you know, for that one, like if it's boar-like or deer-like, I would go and find like the Latin name for it and then just start messing with the letters until like you get something that's kind of near that, that almost suggests the kind of animal it is without saying that's what it is. And some, you know, sometimes that can be a good way to find a name for something that's going back to that core language for stuff. Because then it gives you the kind of sounds you're looking for without making it bore, it's something else. Just as a strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. Because I had another one, and my thought in my head was it's an icicle giraffe, but really tall. But there was no way, there's no snow, there's no what do you call it, Serengeti or safari or anything like that. And so I found it really difficult to try and have the right imagery and to describe it in a short story. You might have so many sentences for a lot of creatures to come up with a lot of different made-up names. So the whole story has all these different, I used maybe some fairies, some goblins, and the rest of all made up. And it was hard for me as a writer to tell, is this going to be too much? Is the reader going to be able to process it fast enough and get the idea?
So you mean the characters would never call it an icicle giraffe, right?
Right, yeah.
Because they don't have that frame of reference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I think sometimes that's like the fun part too, is coming up with a way to really, I mean, that's sometimes where, like, if you turn to the person next to you, I was writing a god that kind of looms over the city, and I was really really struggling to describe it. It's like this, and it's like this, and I drew it, you mean like mallet-shaped? The person next to me just said, well, yeah, okay, so then I could just use that. And the thing, so if you can find even an object, a common object or a common phenomenon to give you that first step toward that shape or that feeling you're looking for, that's just one of those like little instructive moments from kind of like my learning as a writer to figure out, like, try to distill it down to that basic thing and then branching out from there. But yeah, but then also putting it in a world where, like, if the characters need to have a frame of reference to whatever that might be, man, but I guess I really like that stuff.
Yeah.
That's the fun stuff of fantasy sometimes.
Personality traits help too,
Yeah.
you know, does it growl,
Yeah.
does it
Slither.
does
If
it
it's a
cheat?
giraffe,
Right.
if it's a giraffe, it'd be seen very high.
Yeah.
Yes.
Its perspective would be, you know.
And what
I
its
don't know that
steps
they're
would
very
sound like,
vocal.
if it's kind of icy or
Well,
made
right,
of glass.
but you'd be able
It would
to
kind of
see it on a
tinkle or
20-foot
something like
level,
that.
right?
Exactly.
Just research.
How the sun would catch
and
it.
just interpret it.
Yep.
And I hate to break things up, but it's 1:33 now, and I thought this was going to end at 1:30.
145.
Oh, last minute change.
No, I
No,
don't
it's
think so.
got the room,
Is
it's got
that
the
right,
room, it's no
please?
long.
It's to give enough buffer time for the critique group that starts at 2 afterwards.
Right.
Take it
Oh,
down to those other things
I
like-
thought I read somewhere that it was, never mind.
What, so maybe we've all watched the new Star Wars trailer.
Yeah.
No.
It just made me think of Star Wars as an example, because there are a lot of originally unique creatures, Jabba the Hutt, Ewoks, Wookiees, lots of things that George Lucas created. And I think one of the things he did well was fit them into their environments. So, you know, there's the Tauntaun that's all furry and kind of muscular. It's in a snowy world. Jabba the Hutt is in a desert world, and he's no fur at all. He's very fitting your creature into the environment too is I think another.
I was thinking about that earlier about whether or not your story takes place with the human world existing, and is the animal trying to exist in our world, or have they created their own? And then what tools will they have in
Right,
each situation?
We're starting with the environment and saying what kind of creature would live here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah, if you look at
The idea behind Dune.
Wayne Douglas
Sure.
Barlow did that expedition book, where he just did like the zoology of this planet.
Who did?
Wayne Barlow, he did a lot of cover art. But then he's the one who did that Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials, so he just read Ringworld and just drew everything.
I read another book like that. It's called the Diaries of Lewis and Clark. When they went out to the Pacific and back, it reads almost the exact same way. They're describing all these wonderful new creatures that nobody had ever seen before because, you know, nobody had ever been out there before with the ability to write it down.
Yeah, all like a
So if you read the explanation on the first time they run into a grizzly bear, it's phenomenal the way they describe it.
Huh. What was the name of that again?
It's just the Diaries of Lewis and Clark. It's their expedition diaries.
Yeah, and that's basically like what Barlow's doing is, you know, like an expedition across this alien world. And I think the people who did that dinosaurs documentary from way back did an alien world one, where they used the same biology and world building stuff, but just like, let's create an alien world now that we understand how this all works.
That was actually based on Expedition.
Was it?
Yeah.
That's where, okay, that's why it seems so familiar when I saw it.
I think I saw it. No, I mean, the planet itself isn't real. It's just a hypothesis.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah, but the Journals of Lewis and Clark, it's a very real world to us.
Yeah.
The way they describe the things that they saw, because again, they're using a frame of reference to describe these new
Amazing
creatures.
new, yeah, and they're almost on a new planet.
Yep.
There was a similar, this was just nonfiction, and it wasn't a primary source, but there were a couple of books called 1491 and 1493 about America immediately before and after like the discovery by Columbus and sort of the, and I mean, I've only actually read 1493, but it's interesting because he does a very good job of evoking kind of the feelings that these people were having when, I mean, they were going by settlements and they were seeing like cultivated fields and agriculture and that kind of thing that they had no idea what they were looking at because it was so strange compared to what the Europeans and what we today would imagine like this.
Yeah, what is corn?
Well, not just corn, but I mean, keep in mind that, I mean, when they say corn, I mean, they're talking about, you know, I mean, maize, this great multicolored thing that, I mean, is essentially extinct at this point.
Yeah.
And furthermore, that, I mean, like, you wouldn't have, you know, large square plots and everything like that, because what they do is they just go chop a tree down and then use the stump as sort of this fertilizer base, which they plant a bunch of things around. And so you have this very irregular sort of collection of circles of cultivated things. And it was polyculture. I mean, they had all kinds of things growing there because they'd help one another out. And so it just looked like it was some weird, you know, it looked like it was natural, basically. That, I mean, they'd gone and chopped down trees and a bunch of stuff had grown there. And I mean, they, you know, it was easy enough to look at that and say, well, these people are so primitive, they don't even grow plants.
Yeah. I think that really ties into the conversation a lot well too, because you could, if you're creating creatures or using established creatures, figuring out how they interact with their environment and how they modify it to do stuff would really lead you a lot of way toward culture and then the cosmology. And how all that stuff fits together to give them a very complete picture of how that culture functions. But I mean, you'd almost have to set the story there, or have the characters be there for that to be a thing. But like,
yeah, and actually it's a good example too. Just like we were talking about the Native Americans and how they did things. Because some of them did have traditional. I had never heard of this until 6 months ago. But Cahokia, you never heard of Cahokia? It was one of the largest cities, you know, in the world. At the time, this is in the, I think, 1200s, 1400s, somewhere in there, and they, you know, they were doing trade in theory across the entire world along the Mississippi River, and at any rate, but they had, you know, like up to 40,000 people. They did have some traditional maize agricultures, and then the whole civilization collapsed, which is another interesting thing we'll get into. But that type of you know, ancient civilization is a good thing to draw from. I'm really fascinated by that and getting ideas from that for one of my stories. The research part is fun.
is another aspect that you can use to describe your character, is showing where they're from. You know, going to their home world. I'm thinking of Aliens, where they go to the aliens don't necessarily have a
That's
home
true.
world,
They're
but
biological.
they went to that other ship and
Yeah,
saw what it had done there. That tells us a lot about without ever seeing the creatures.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So you can, there's ways you can show aspects of your creature by what the impact they have physically or mentally, emotionally, or whatever. Lovecraft is great at this. He does never show his monsters. He just shows people running in fear, gibbering, you know, and it drove them crazy. If I were to describe it to you, it would drive you mad. You know, that kind of stuff is kind of cop out, if you ask me, but it can be effective.
Well, yeah, and that's at the Mountains of Madness too, where you never see the creatures, but
Right.
well, maybe you do at one point, but just like here's the city they left behind.
Right. Yeah.
So you really get a sense of who they are or what they are from the architecture and the art.
Yeah, I don't know about, you know, just leaving an effect, you know, and saying, well, this is someone, you know, by how they caused this effect. You know, that doesn't give a real good description of that person.
But if I walk in a room and see a bunch of bodies that were destroyed by something, the way that they were destroyed, like your bone cracker thing, that what it would leave behind, and you saw that, you don't even need to see it to know I don't like it, and I need to go get a shotgun, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's a more, you know, foreshadowing in a way than anything else.
Exactly, that's what it is, yeah.
Most of archaeology and anthropology is looking at what's left behind and discerning what.
Yeah, it's a riddle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to extrapolate what this thing is by what it leaves behind and where it lives.
I mean, the one thing you have to be careful with that is that, I mean, you won't necessarily be able to meet expectations. That was actually something that Lovecraft thought was one of the biggest flaws in his work, because there are a lot of things where you have a lot of buildup about how this thing is so horrible and it drives all these people insane and stuff, and then they finally have a reveal, and it's like, well, okay, I'm still sane. It seems not that bad.
I mean, it really works if we never see it, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, like, for instance, his favorite story was, that he wrote was the music of Eric Zahn, which explains essentially nothing of what's going on. And it is much more terrifying. I mean, like, it's, I can see why, I mean, I would argue it's the same thing. It probably is his best story. And I mean, he just,
Kind of the Blair Witch effect.
yeah. I mean, it's even kind of funny because, like, as opposed to normally when the characters are always going around and hunting for all of these cryptic clues and everything like that, the, in this particular one, the main character just, like, finds someone and asks him, what the hell is going on? And he's like, ah, yes, allow me to explain. And he has, I mean, he basically only speaks German, and the other guy is speaking English, and so he's like, well, okay, you know some French, and I can write French, so I'll write down this explanation. He writes like an 80-page explanation, and then it all gets like tossed out a window or something like that before the protagonist could read it.
I'll have to remember that one.
But yeah, no, I mean, I recommend that one. And I mean, obviously they're all in the public domain now, so. But,
Yeah. The French didn't mean a damn right there. Well, I gotta get going. It was nice to meet everybody.
It was nice to meet you.
yeah, you as well.
Thank you for the opportunity to do your work.
Oh, you're
earlier.
welcome. Thank you for reading.
Not much time left. Is there anything we didn't cover? Anything we didn't discuss?
Probably go on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is going on forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, then we get awfully boring then.
I think we've about covered it.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting that throughout the history of storytelling that the reptiles are always the bad guys.
Yeah, we don't like
Yeah.
The warm-blooded animals are always the good guys.
Well, I think that there should be more attempts to change that. Like, I find natural legends to have some reptile protagonists.
Isn't that Enemy Mine? Isn't that the movie that's got a reptile?
Yep.
Planted on there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's one of the few that I can think of.
And there's
that
even been
plays with that whole.
But that was a movie.
Xenophobia type of thing.
The Humanics Commonwealth by Alan Dean Foster the two, like the major federation of the good guys is the humans, and then the Franks, which are these basically big praying mantises. And
they're like friendly and everything.
yeah, no, I mean,
One of the main characters for
and I mean, at the same time, it's still kind of debatable because the big rebellious species in there that's sort of like their main nemesis are these, giant reptile type things. But the
and there's also the Argonians from the Elder Scrolls. They're reptiles. And they're playable.
Oh, maybe it's just those cultural associations we have, just like poisonous snakes, poisonous bugs, things that irritate us.
What's
things
really
that scare
interesting
us.
is that those types transcend cultures, because if you read any mythology, actually if you read any mythology in depth, it's almost all the same stories.
Yeah. Joseph Campbell type of stuff, if you're familiar with any of it, all based on archetypes.
Well,
Do you remember Dennis Hopper played a reptilian critter in the what was it
Mario
called?
Brothers movie?
Mario
Yeah.
Brothers, yeah.
oh yeah,
And I thought
Monkey.
I thought that was
See ya later,
job.
alligator.
Yeah, I thought that was, he was a bad guy, but he was likable too.
Yeah, probably the only redeeming factor of that movie. It's actually sort of an internet meme where they edit together two of his most weirdest lines, "Papa" and "monkey." And so we get a "Papa, monkey, Papa, monkey."
Oh, goodness. So,
No.
yeah. Well, if you just took, say, a critter like a spider or something that everybody hates and made it likable.
Charlotte's Web?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
What about like
There
a
you go.
tarantula?
See, it's been done.
There's the earwig and House of Morgan. I like that. Now when I see earwigs, I like them.
I know another story where a not so
Unlock the
likable
door,
animal has been the
open the
protagonist. There's a Deadly Creatures, a video game where you play as a tarantula and scorpion, which interestingly also has Dennis Hopper in it, where he and Billy Bob Thornton play the only human characters in it.
Two of the weirdest people in Hollywood.
Yeah.
What was the book you mentioned?
House of the Morian by Pat O'Shea. She's an Irish author, so it's all this Irish tradition, but the Morian is chasing these two little kids, and the earwig comes with them. They find the earwig in the garden, and then eventually you can kind of see things from its perspective, and it saves them at one point.
Did
It dies.
get anything from
Can't remember. It's not a book for
but I hope
kids.
the next
Just has
future
young
meetings of me
protagonists.
expand more of my world because
Yeah.
I've got the mythology and
I
like,
hope
I
it will
need,
too.
I need stories and discipline.
Okay.
So that story's rooted a lot in Irish mythology?
Yeah, and very well done. So the Morian is a devil type spirit, and I can't remember why she's chasing the kids. But so they're traveling a little bit throughout Ireland, and they use sort of these rose symbols and the hounds, and I don't know, it was very good. Cool.
The other book that came to mind about writing about animals was Jonathan Livingston's Seagull.
That's a good one too.
You guys probably all too younger. But it was a very popular book in like the 70s, I think. You know, little tiny thin paperback about a seagull who he wasn't an ordinary seagull. He liked doing acrobatics in the air and fancy stuff, and that made him ostracized, and it was a find yourself, tearjerker type thing. And wildly popular at the time, and the whole thing was from the point of the seagull. So,
The Secrets of Nim is a good book too.
yeah, I've heard of that one. I haven't
I
read
haven't read
it.
that in a long time, but that was a whole race
By the way,
of
Ralph,
Yeah, I read it in school.
mouse that rides a motorcycle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Stuart, wasn't there a mouse on TV called Stuart? that was
Stuart
riding a
Little.
motorcycle? Stuart Little, yeah.
Book's not so good though.
It's good when you're in Florida.
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold up at the time. Maybe that's a better, more plain way to
Yeah.
put it.
There's a background painting in that movie, Stuart Little, which was eventually identified as a missing masterpiece.
Really?
That was worth like $8 million or something. I don't know, it wasn't that much money, but it was still like quite a large amount, and it just happened to be this one art student like watching it with his kid and recognized it as this painting that had been missing for like 60 years.
And it was the actual paintings?
Yeah.
Oh, this is a live action version of
Yeah.
Stuart Little?
That's strange.
The movie with Hugh Laurie and I don't remember some of the other people.
Oh, yeah, backstory on my comment about the book, too, by the way, is, was it E.B. White, is right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He wrote that book, he rushed it, and I think he died very soon after, so that's why I didn't do much editing. Why Stuart, the book isn't, I made that joke, because it isn't as a novel. I'm like, what's all the hype on this book? And it is, kids are a lot more forgiving readers.
Did he also write The Trumpet of the Swan?
Yeah.
Okay, I remember
like
that one.
one.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, that was interesting. Wasn't it the swan couldn't trumpet?
Yeah.
He needed an actual trumpet
Yeah.
to make
I think
the
it was
sound.
definitely, because it must have been like Ugly Duckling inspired, but I think he was actually a swan who just didn't have the ability to.
Yeah.
This might have been something that came up before I got here, but have any of you done or seen, I mean, anything that would stand out in terms of like xeno-fiction, something which is written from the perspective of, I mean, it wouldn't even necessarily have to be like a completely original alien. It might be like a bird or a dog or something like that, but it is specifically like intended to give a more realistic portrait of how like they would see the world and how they would think differently and that kind of thing.
We're talking about Ender's Game and Xenophobia. They might be but they're supporting characters, but I think that's in third person, so I think you get in the heads of the alien species a little bit more.
Get that part right.
Yeah, a bit.
There's some elements like that. Margaret mentioned Watership Down.
Watership Down.
No, somebody else did, I think.
Did,
Wait, yeah, I think you did, and then I sort of expanded on it.
Yeah, Xenophobia is his book.
The Xenocide.
Xenocide, thank you. Xenocide, and there's 4 species that are all kind of crammed onto one planet, and they have to kind of learn to get along with each other with the natives and the transplanted colonists and stuff like that. And I think, we were not 100% sure, but that's part of the book, is these different philosophies. Can they learn to live with each other, or are they going to kill each other?
Yeah, there's a
and
little
they're
like
sharing the
pequeños, the little pig people.
Yeah, and
then the buggers
tree,
and
yeah, that's right. They're part of their tree life cycle. Is part of their life cycle. It's pretty.
Well, yeah, but very little of it is actually from their perspective.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's
what I
almost
wasn't
all
sure
from
of.
the
Yeah,
humans.
I know what you're saying.
you're probably gonna find more of that in short fiction.
Stories. A lot of dog. This is what the dog is looking at and seeing.
There was a book called Silverwing or something like that.
yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, everybody is a bat. And there's some point of view of bat, and that does interesting things like he never mentions color because they can't see color. The first book is really good. The other books are not good. So find the first one in the series if you're interested in looking at the point of view of that.
Yeah, I mean, the guy who did Watership Down actually also did a number about dogs himself. Plague Dogs, which is about these dogs that escape from like a lab somewhere, and the people trying to track them down because, I mean, the experiments they're conducting are illegal, say that they're plague dogs so that they'll get reported by anyone who sees them. But
And the newest Planet of the Apes does it really, really well.
True.
Oh.
One that I'd like to try and do, but I'm having to work it out because it's about a homeless kid who's been abused, and all these animals help her, but they're not really helping her. She thinks they're helping her. They're helping themselves and accidentally helping her. They all have their own agendas. They all have their own likes and dislikes and what works for them, and so it would be an entire cast of people working at cross purposes who work together for various reasons. And I'm still trying to work out how that's going to work, so we'll see.
Sounds like there's going to be a lot of debates. But you're good at writing dialogue, so I think that'll be fine.
No, that's the problem. There isn't going to be any dialogue. They don't speak. I mean, these are real dogs and cats and what have you, so.
How are you going to write a story with no dialogue?
I don't know. And therein lies the problem.